Tony was standing at the altar. His heart was pounding in his chest. He adjusted the sleeve of his grey tuxedo, trying to calm himself down, but nothing seemed to help. The ocean waves crashed gently on the shore. The white sand beneath his feet warmed under the bright afternoon sun. The beach was decorated beautifully. White flowers lined the aisle, and colorful ribbons danced in the breeze. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. Maria. Maria wasn't there. The guests, dressed in vibrant, colorful ashoke, sat in their seats, whispering to each other. Tony could feel their eyes on him. Their curious glances was growing more concerned with each passing minute. His mother, Mrs. Johnson, sat in the front row, her face a mask of calm, but Tony could see the tension in her eyes. It had been over an hour. Maria was supposed to have walked down the aisle by now. Where is she? Tony's mind raced as he glanced around, looking for any sign of her. His best friend, Kelvin, leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry, bro. She's probably just running late. You know women and makeup. I'm sure she will be here in no time. Maybe something went wrong with her car. Her driver, have you tried reaching them?" But Tony wasn't so sure. Maria had been excited about this day. They had talked about it for months, planned every single detail together. She wouldn't just leave him standing there, would she? Mrs. Johnson stood up and walked over to him, her face filled with concern. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tony, maybe we should postpone the ceremony. It had been too long." Tony felt his heart drop. "Postpone? Mama, you mean postpone?" The words echoed in his mind, and he shook his head. "No, she will be here. She has to be. She has no other option than to come down here." But deep down, a part of him knew something. Something was wrong. As the minutes passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, it became clear Maria wasn't coming. Tony's world felt like it was falling apart. The guests began to leave, some murmuring words of pity, others casting curious glances his way. Kelvin helped him back to his car, but Tony could barely hear his friends' comforting words. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Where was Maria? Why didn't she come? When they got back to the house, Tony sat down heavily on the couch, staring at his phone. He had called Maria several times, but there was no answer. Her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried calling her parents, but they didn't know where she was either. It was as if she had disappeared. Mrs. Johnson walked into the room, her face calm as she sat beside Tony. "Son, I know this is so hard for you, but maybe it's for the best. If she really loved you, she wouldn't have left you like this. She left you standing at the altar." Tony looked at his mother. Confusion and hurt were in his eyes. "But why, Mom? Why would she do this? We were happy, weren't we? Or so I thought. From my own end, I feel we were happy." Mrs. Johnson sighed, patting his hand gently. "Sometimes people have secrets. Maybe there was something about Maria that you didn't know. It's not your fault, my son. Please, cheer up." Tony felt anger rising in his chest. He didn't want to believe that Maria had kept secret from him. They had shared everything, or so he thought and believed. But now, doubt started to creep into his mind. Was there something he was missing? For days, Tony barely slept or ate. He couldn't stop thinking about Maria, couldn't stop wondering where she was and why she had left him on their wedding day. He tried calling her friends, but no one had heard from her. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. Little did Tony know that his mother had played a bigger role in Maria's disappearance than he could have ever imagined. Mrs. Johnson had never approved of Maria from the moment Tony introduced her. Mrs. Johnson had seen her as unsuitable for her son. Maria came from a modest background And Mrs. Johnson had always dreamed of Tony marrying someone with a prestigious family, someone who could elevate their status in the church and the community. When Mrs. Johnson found out that Maria was pregnant, just weeks before the wedding, she was so furious. She had overheard Maria talking to her mother on the phone. One evening, when she had visited Tony's apartment, the words had shocked her. Pregnant and out of wedlock. Mrs. Johnson's mind raced. If the church found out that Maria was pregnant before the wedding, it would ruin their reputation. Mrs. Johnson had spent years building her standing in the church. She was part of the women's committee. She was the women's leader president, organizing events, leading prayers, and ensuring her family was seen as outstanding members of the community. A pregnancy scandal would destroy everything. That night, Mrs. Johnson made up her mind. Maria just have to go. At first, Mrs. Johnson tried to be discreet. She called Maria to meet her at a small cafe, away from the eyes of the community. When Maria arrived, Mrs. Johnson forced a smile, though her eyes were very cold. Maria, dear, she began. Her voice was sweet but firm. I've had some concerning news. I understand you are in a difficult situation, but I'm here to help you. Maria looked confused. I'm not sure what you are saying. I don't understand, Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, lowering her voice. I know you are pregnant, Maria. And I know you think marrying Tony is the solution, but it's not. You are not right for him. He deserves someone who can uphold the family's name and reputation in the church. Imagine being pregnant before church wedding. Who does that? That's not how I raise my children. I can't allow that. Maria's eyes widened in shock. You are asking me to leave Tony, ma? Mrs. Johnson nodded, her smile never reaching her eyes. Yes, I'm willing to compensate you for your troubles. Here, she slid an envelope across the table, filled with cash. Take this money and disappear. Leave my son. It's the best thing for everyone. Maria stared at the envelope. Her heart was pounding. She had never expected this. She had always said that Mrs. Johnson didn't fully accept her. But this was cruel. I can't do that, ma, Maria said, her voice trembling. Ma, I love Tony. We are going to have a family soon. Mrs. Johnson's face hardened. You think you can raise a child with him? In this situation, haven't you been listening to me or what? The church will find out and we will all be ruined. You will ruin my son's future. Maria stood up, her hands shaking. I won't leave him, ma. We'll figure this out together. Mrs. Johnson watched her leave, her eyes narrowing. If Maria wasn't going to take the money, Mrs. Johnson would have to take more drastic action. Mrs. Johnson wasn't a woman to be disobeyed. After Maria refused her offer, she came up with a new plan. She would make sure Maria was out of Tony's life for good. She called Maria again a few days later, this time with a more cunning approach. Maria, I've really been thinking about you, my daughter. Maybe I was too harsh the other day, and I know you really love my son, Tony. I want what's best for him. Please, let's meet and talk again. Maria was hesitant but hopeful that things could work out this time. She agreed to meet Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson took her to a quiet, isolated building, a convent, far outside the city. As they walked inside, Maria started to feel uneasy. The walls were cold, the hall silent. She didn't understand why Mrs. Johnson had brought her here. This place will help you, Maria, Mrs. Johnson said softly. They will take care of you while you have the baby. It's the best solution for everyone. Maria's eyes widened in fear. What? No, ma. I'm not staying here. My wedding is today. But before Maria could leave, two nuns appeared at the door, blocking her path. Mrs. Johnson's smile faded as she looked at Maria coldly. You don't have a choice. Maria, you will stay here, have your child, and then live Tony's life. If you try to leave, I will make sure your family suffers. I've already spoken to them and they know what will happen if they cross me. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She felt trapped, scared and helpless. She had no way out. Mrs. Johnson had manipulated everyone, leaving her no choice but to stay at the convent. 2 years passed and Tony still had no answers. Maria had never returned and her disappearance had left a permanent scar on his heart. He tried to move on, throwing himself into work and spending time with friends, but the pain lingered. His mother had been by his side, comforting him, telling him that Maria wasn't right for him, but deep down, Tony never stopped wondering what had happened to her. Then one day, everything changed. Tony was at the supermarket picking up grocery when he saw her, Maria. She was standing by the fruit section, holding a little girl's hand, a girl with dark, cold, and bright brown eyes that looked just like his. Tony's heart stopped. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Maria had a child. And that child, who is she? Tony walked over, his legs feeling weak beneath him. Maria! Maria turned. Her face was pale as she saw him, her eyes filled with shock and fear, but she didn't say a word. Tony looked at the little girl, then back at her, at Maria. His mind was racing. He had so many questions, but his heart was pounding too hard to make sense of anything. Is this your daughter? Tony asked. His voice was shaky. Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. Yes, Tony, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She's our daughter. Our daughter? Tony felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. He looked at the little girl again. Her big brown eyes stared up at him innocently. She looked just like him. There was no doubt this was his child. His heart ached as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Why didn't you tell me? Tony asked, his voice thick with emotions. Why did you leave me? Where did you go to? Maria's face crumbled and she looked down, unable to meet his eyes. It's complicated, Tony. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. Allowed to? Tony's confusion turned to anger. You weren't allowed to. What are you saying? What do you mean? Maria, by who? How? Who stopped you from telling me? So many questions. Maria hesitated, glancing around the supermarket as if afraid someone was watching them. Tony, we can't talk here, please. Can we meet somewhere else? I'll explain everything, but you have to promise me something. What? Tony's heart raced as he tried to make sense of her words. What is it? Promise me you won't tell your mother. Not yet. Maria said, her voice trembling. Please, Tony, I will explain everything, but not here. Meet me tomorrow at the park of the old church, please. Tony was confused. What did his mother have to do with any of this? But he could see the fear in Maria's eyes, and something told him that whatever she had to say was very important. Reluctantly, he nodded. Okay, I will meet you tomorrow. Maria let out a shaky breath, nodded, and then walked away with the little girl, leaving Tony standing in the middle of the supermarket, his mind spinning. The next day, Tony arrived at the park by the old church. His heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that Maria had something important to tell him, something that would change everything. Maria was already there, sitting on a bench, nervously wringing her hands. The little girl wasn't with her this time. Tony walked over, his mind still filled with question. Maria, he said softly as he sat down beside her, please tell me what's going on. Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me about our daughter? Maria took a deep breath, her eyes filled with sadness and guilt. Tony, I never wanted to leave you. I loved you more than anything in this world. But Tony, I didn't have a choice. Tony frowned, confusion and anger bubbling up inside him. What do you mean you didn't have a choice? Of course you had a choice. Maria shook her head, tears filling her eyes. No, Tony, your mother. She found out I was pregnant before the wedding. She didn't want me in your life. She didn't want the church to know that I'm pregnant before we were married. She said it will ruin her reputation. Tony stared at her in disbelief. My mother? What are you talking about? She told me she didn't know why you disappeared. Maria let out a bitter laugh. Wiping away her tears. Of course she did. She offered me money to leave you, Tony. She said if I took the money and disappeared, I could live my life in peace and let you move on. But I refused. I loved you and I wanted us to be a family. But your mother, she had other plans. Tony felt sick to his stomach as he listened to Maria's word. His mother had always been controlling, but this right here was too much. Maria continued, her voice trembling. When I refused to take the money, your mother tricked me. She told me she was taking me somewhere safe, somewhere where I could have the baby in peace. But it was a lie. Tony, she took me to a convent far from the city and left me there. I couldn't leave. They locked me in and I had no way to contact you. I was trapped. Tony's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of what Maria was saying began to sink in. His mother had done this. She had kept Maria away from him, locked her in a convent, all because she was afraid of what the church would think. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Tony asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you come back after you had the baby? Maria wiped her tears, her face filled with pain. Because your mother threatened my family. Tony, she said if I ever try to contact you, she will ruin my parents. She told me that I would destroy your life, that you would never forgive me for lying to you about the pregnancy. I believed her. I was scared and I thought staying away was the only way to protect you. Tony's hand clenched into fist as anger surged through him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own mother had done this to him. She had torn his life apart, kept him from the woman he loved, and had hidden his daughter from him. Tony couldn't wait any longer. After his conversation with Maria, he went straight home, his mind racing with anger and betrayal. He found Mrs. Johnson sitting in the living room, sipping tea as if nothing was wrong. Mom, Tony said, his voice tight with emotions. We need to talk. Mrs. Johnson looked up, her smile fading when she saw the look on his face. What's wrong, Tony? Tony's heart pounded in his chest as he stood before her, his hand shaking with rage. I saw Maria. Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in surprise, and she set her teacup down slowly. Oh, and what did she have to say, that woman? Tony clenched his feet, his voice shaking with anger. She told me everything, Mama, about how you paid her to leave me, how you sent her to a convent, how you threatened her and her family. How could you do that to me? How could you keep my child from me? Mrs. Johnson's face was pale and she stood up, her hands trembling. Tony, I was only trying to protect you. You don't understand what it would have done to our family, to our reputation in church. If people had found out that Maria was pregnant before the wedding, we would have been ruined forever. Ruined? Tony shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. You care more about your reputation than my happiness. You tore my life apart. And for what, Mama? So you could save face in front of the church. I lost 2 years of my daughter's life because of you. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears and she reached out to him. Tony, I did it for you. I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to throw your life away on someone who wasn't good enough for you. Tony stepped back, shaking his head. You didn't do it for me, Mama. You did it for yourself, for your own selfish reasons. You never cared about what I wanted. You only cared about what people would think. Mrs. Johnson sobbed, falling to her knees. I'm so sorry, Tony. Please forgive me. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting our family. But Tony couldn't hear her words. The anger, the betrayal, it was too much. He turned and walked away, leaving his mother crying on the floor. He couldn't look at her anymore. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his family, had been shattered. The weeks that followed were filled with pain and confusion for Tony. He tried to come to terms with what had happened, but it was hard. His mother's betrayal had cut him deep and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive him. He avoided her calls and didn't visit her for a long time. But there was one bright spot in his life now, his daughter. Tony began spending more time with Maria and her little girl, trying to make up for the years they had lost. At first, it was awkward, but as the days went by, they started to rebuild their connection. Tony realized that despite everything, he still loved Maria, and more than anything, he wanted to be there for their daughter. Maria was hesitant at first, unsure if Tony would ever forgive her for staying away, but Tony assured her that he understood. His mother had manipulated everything, and Maria had been trapped. Slowly, they began to rebuild their relationship. One evening, as they sat together watching their daughter play, Tony turned to Maria and took her hand. "I'm sorry for everything, Maria. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." Maria smiled. "It wasn't your fault, Tony. We were both victims of your mother's plan." Tony sighed, looking out at their daughter. "I missed so much, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Maria nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Tony, together." As they sat there, watching their little girl laugh and play, Tony realized that despite all the pain and betrayal, he had something worth fighting for: his family. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone take it away. Mrs. Johnson sat alone in her quiet living room. The once beautiful, lively home felt empty without Tony and his family. The silence was heavy, and it was a silence she had created. She had thought she was protecting her son by hiding the truth, but in the end, she had lost him. Tony had stopped visiting her. He didn't answer her calls. He didn't come over for dinner anymore. The door to their relationship was shut, and she felt the deep pain of her actions. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Mrs. Johnson whispered to herself. "I just wanted to protect him." But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been more concerned about her reputation, about how things looked in the church, than about what really mattered: her son's happiness, his family, and his love. Those should have been her priority. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she thought about the years she had missed, the moments with her granddaughter that will never be. Tony had built a beautiful life with Maria and their daughter, and Mrs. Johnson was no longer a part of it. "I'm sorry," she said, even though no one was there to hear. "I was wrong." She realized too late that love is more important than appearances. It is more important to be there for the people you love, to listen to them, and to respect their choices. She wished she could turn back time, but she knew she couldn't. As she wiped her tears, Mrs. Johnson made a promise to herself. She would change. If she ever got the chance, she would try to make things right with Tony and Maria. She would put her family first above her pride and be the mother her son needed. But for now, all she could do was wait and hope that one day Tony could forgive her. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, family, and life lesson, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every story is a new adventure, and we would love for you to be part of our growing community. Click the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and never miss an exciting tale. Thank you for being here. Till I see you again in my next story. Goodbye.